Good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to be here today to tell you a bit about my research, and I thank L'Oréal and UNESCO for the opportunity and for recognizing my research. And this is my research project. I will spend much more time talking about what are my plans rather than what I've done so far. So hold on while we set off on this journey to Africa. So my research in general, if I just should spend one slide talking about this, is about both extinct and endangered species. This means species that are already gone and species that may disappear soon if we don't do something to prevent it. And at the first glance, it might seem a little bit strange. What does a woolly mammoth have to do with like African leopards? But in reality, there's a lot that they do have in common. Both of these species, before the woolly mammoth became extinct, had really small population size, as is the case for the leopards now, and for the other species that you actually see in the pictures. This means that they were restricted to small populations, only a few individuals, and by learning from species that already did go extinct, we can actually learn about what's happening in the species which might become extinct, and maybe even how to prevent it. So I'm studying DNA of all of these species and trying to understand what is happening, how close they are to extinction, how do we recognize it, and how do we prevent it. And if there's something that we've learned in recent years, is that to understand what's going to happen in the future and what is happening in present, we also need to understand what happened in the past, and we are studying evolutionary history of species. So I'm very much working on temporal scales, meaning that I'm trying to look into the past, into the present, and into the future. And I'm going to use the same structure in describing my project. So to start, we will start in the present. And throughout the talk, I will be talking only about elephants, because that's the species that I'm working on right now and that my project is on. And there are two species of elephants living in Africa today. They are called the savanna and the forest elephant. And you can quite easily recognize them on a first glance based on where they live, which is also reflected in their name, but also how they look. So they look a little bit differently. The savanna elephant is a little bit bigger. It has a little bit different behavior. But most strikingly, I guess when you look at the map, you can see that they live in different places. The forest elephant lives mostly in the forest areas, in the tropics, near the equator. And the savanna elephant lives in the orange parts in the savanna, which is kind of surrounding the equatorial rainforest. And if you look at the map, you might think that the range looks really patchy, that sort of they only look in these small pieces of land around here. But it wasn't always the case. If we look at a map of where elephants were distributed in the past, they lived basically everywhere in Africa. And it has been only in recent years, or over the last few centuries, that they retreated and got restrained into these few small patches of land. And the reason why they used to be so common, but are not anymore, of course, is ivory. And we don't have to go far to find evidence of why that is. This is a picture that I took myself in a castle here in Denmark, and it well explains why elephants are disappearing, because people have always been interested in their ivory. It is not just something that has become common in the colonial times, in the last 2 centuries. This is something that has been important for humans for hundreds, even thousands of years. Ivory was the thing which defined trade routes in the past. Already in the Roman times, people were trading ivory. It was a luxury, it was a commodity, people were carving it, selling it, and it was always important. However, it's kind of difficult to trace back in history how elephants were declining or how the population was doing, because we don't have the records. The records start maybe in 1979, but before that, we don't really know how many elephants there were. But we know that in 1979, they did the first count, and they counted 1.3 million elephants in Africa. What is concerning, though, is that only 8 years later, there were less than half than that. And that really scared people. So, for example, President of Kenya in 1989 did the first public burning of ivory. This was ivory which was captured from illegal killing, that they caught the poached ivory, or they found the elephants that were killed. And just to show that elephants are more valuable alive than they are dead, they burned the ivory. And they have done it many more times since then. Also, the International Commission for Conservation of Nature introduced an international ban on selling ivory. And that actually helped a lot, and the elephants started to come back, increase in numbers again. However, as with everything in the world, there's always different interests. And you can imagine that if you are a, let's say, poor country in Africa, and you have large stockpiles of ivory, which was either collected from elephants that died naturally, or was collected when they caught poachers. And you have all this value sitting in your storage. So some countries actually got permission to sell ivory, and some countries managed to sell off their ivory. There were 2 times of one-time sell-offs to Japan and China in 2002 and 2008, where they were allowed to sell the ivory that they had in their stockpiles. And you would think that, well, that can't really do much harm, right? But actually it did, because it stimulated the interest. It also coincided with time when some countries in Asia, like China, were experiencing economic growth, which means that people had more money and were able to actually buy things which were supposed to be luxurious items before. So more people could buy it, more people got interested into it. And since 2009, there has been a huge boom in poaching. This is a graph from South Africa, where the poaching rates were a little bit delayed and started in 2014. But you can see that the number of poached elephants, which is the number on the y-axis, sort of declined over the time through the 90s. Then there was almost nothing through the 2000s. But again, then from 2014, the poaching rates went really high up. And as a result, the conservation status of elephants has been reclassified. There has been actually also a change. And in the beginning, I told you that there are 2 species of elephants in Africa, but it's also a new thing. So only in February this year, we still said that in Africa there's only 1 species, the African elephant. And only in March, they actually changed it. And that's because people already knew for like 20 years that there are actually 2 species, but it's not so easy to just say, oh yeah, we will just from now on say that there are 2 species. You actually have to get the numbers, you have to say how many elephants of each species there are, where exactly they live, which countries, and what is their conservation status. So it took a while. But what I wanted to show you here is the way we classify how much threatened are species. We have this table from the IUCN, which here are 2 categories which basically say that we don't have much data, we don't know. Then there are 2 categories, least concern and near threatened, which mean that there's not too much concern about these species, they are doing okay, well, everything is quite fine. Then there are 3 categories, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered, which mean that the species is threatened by extinction to different degrees. And then the next step is extinct in the wild, which means that the species still might be surviving in the zoos, in private collections, but not in the wild. And until February, African elephant was considered vulnerable, which is the sort of the lowest of the 3 endangerment categories. But since March, it's not so anymore. And while the savanna elephant is considered endangered, the forest elephant is critically endangered, which means that, as I mentioned, the next step is only extinct in the wild. So there's no plan B. This is the 11th hour. If we don't protect them now, they are going to disappear. But luckily, as maybe you also like elephants, people like elephants, because they are just very relatable. They are very smart, they have emotions, they have memory. They are amazing animals, and people care about them, which is good, because that means there's a lot of conservation organizations. People do want to protect them. So people are trying to do different things. One of them is anti-poaching, so just having rangers in the park trying to scare off the poachers, protect the elephants. Then there's anti-trafficking. So units which are trying to capture the trade, try to capture the seize the ivory on the way. And the last one is human-elephant conflict. Because even though I speak mostly about the poaching, a huge issue is also that the population in Africa is also growing. There's more cities, there's more communications, more roads, and less space for elephants. So more often, they do come into contact with humans. And imagine if you're a farmer and an elephant comes and destroys your field, and that was supposed to be your food for the year, you get angry and you do want to kill the animal. And of course, we have to try to find solutions for that too. But one thing which I think is still missing is how we can use DNA and genetic information to better protect the species. And of course, that these issues are much more grave. We have to solve this before anything else. But I think we also need to be ready, and we need to have all the information we can have so that we can try to do our best to prevent elephants disappearing. And my work is, of course, not the first genetic work on elephants. There has been many more. These are just two of them. But I wanted to show these because I'm lucky enough to work with two of the people who have done some of the major work in the field of elephant genetics. I'm working with Hans Sigismund here at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm also working with Alfred Roca from the University of Illinois. And they have mostly worked with traditional genetic markers, like microsatellites and mitochondrial DNA, but now we can actually get much more data. So what I'm doing now is that I'm using their collections of samples so that we don't have to disturb any more elephants. We are just using samples that are already there. This means just pieces of tissue or fecal samples or pieces of skin that they collected for genetic analysis before. And I'm trying to get or use new techniques to get many more or much more genetic information. And this is just a map showing all the places from which we have samples. So I'm trying to really get a good representation of elephant diversity throughout Africa. It's quite a lot. Of course, there are many, many gaps, but we are actually sequencing 200 elephants, which is going to be quite unprecedented sample, and hopefully will give us a good picture. So what we can get to know with this data is what, for example, is the population structure, how close the populations are to each other, what is the gene flow. So, for example, we assume there's quite a good connection between East Africa and South Africa, but in order to quantify it and make sure that where are these transects, where do we need to preserve the genetic diversity, we need the data. And also the different regions had very different demographic histories. This means that, for example, let's say the impact of humans in West Africa was much more significant, which is also reflected in the fact that we have less samples because it's just so difficult to get the samples. There are not so many elephants left. There are some herds which only are 50 individuals left. And that makes our job more difficult, but also much more important. Now to switch to the past. So I told you that we need to understand what happened in the past to be able to understand why, how did we get here. And I showed you the map of where, in all the places where elephants used to live, and they don't anymore. But we can't really get to them. I mean, if we only use the modern data, the present-day data, we will never capture that information. But one unlikely source of information that we have is, for example, shipwreck ivory. We can use ivory, which was traded, sent on ships from one place to another, and we can use it to reconstruct the diversity of elephants that are no longer there. And I'm working with ivory from a sunk ship, which sank off the coast of Spain, and it's called Bajo de la Campana. And it's a ship which presumably sailed from somewhere in North Africa, we think Carthage, because based on what they found in the ship, the archaeologists think that this ship belonged to Phoenicians. And what we think is that happened is that it sailed from Carthage to Spain, and then it, for some reason, sank near the coast. And it happened 2,500 years ago. These are some pictures from the excavation. So there was a proper maritime archaeology excavation, and they found many interesting things, some amphoras. But also what interests me more are these things which you can barely see here, and these are elephant tusks. They found 64 elephant tusks there, and 51 of them were recovered. And I got access to 3 of them, and I analyzed them in the lab. And I don't have the results yet because this project just started in June, so this is the very first work that I have done. This is me working in the ancient DNA laboratory together with my colleague. So you saw the tusks on the previous slide, and this is just a small piece of ivory from one of them. What we do is that we go to the lab and we put on these suits and masks, which you became maybe more familiar with now in these periods, but we used to wear face masks much longer before Corona happened, just to protect the sample. Because the DNA in this old sample is so degraded that we have to make sure that not a single cell from our body, from my hair, from my skin, falls into the tube. And that's why we work so covered up. What we do here is that we use this kind of handheld drill to just shave off the surface of the ivory, to remove any contamination, the surface which you touched with your fingers, and then we drill inside just to get into the inner part which was better protected. And while we are drilling, there's powder flying off. And we collect it, and then we use various chemicals to extract DNA out of it. And yeah, as I said, I don't have the results yet, but we get some DNA, and the DNA looks old. So now the only next step is, let's just hope that the DNA is actually from elephants and not just from bacteria or algae from the water. But we'll see about it. And what this will tell us is, hopefully, something about North African elephants. Since we think that the ship sailed from North Africa, and you probably know that there are no elephants living in North Africa anymore, but there used to be. And the population went extinct, and we actually know nothing about them. This is one of the very few depictions of how the elephants probably looked like then. And this is actually a depiction from Italy of a boar elephant. And what we think is that these elephants which lived in North Africa were the same kind of elephant which Hannibal used to invade Italy. So it would be a great source of information about elephants which we have no other way of learning about from. Now that I told you how we are looking at the past and present, I'm going to tell you a bit more about this specific project and looking into the future. And one way how genetics is already helping conservation is through forensics and through analyzing DNA from seized ivory. That means that, for example, when they ship a big shipment of ivory from somewhere in Africa to China, and somebody catches it, and they do genetic analysis, they can find out where the ivory came from. And that can be helpful to actually try to tell us something about the trade routes. And there has been a lot of these, like a lot. And every time they are bigger. In March 2019, there was one which was the world's largest ivory seizure. Just a few months later, there was another one which was the world's biggest one with 9 tons of ivory. That's hundreds of elephants killed. And I told you that we can learn about the trade routes and how they are transported. So we can reconstruct the elephants, which region of Africa they are coming from, how they are transported, and where they end up. And when we look over the data through time, we can also see that the trade routes are changing. We can see that in the beginning it was sort of much less organized. And I told you that after the ivory stockpiles were released in 2008, there was a huge boom in China. And you can see in 2009, suddenly the main route becomes this. But you can also see that over the years, as, again, the legislation started to catch up, people started to be worried and try to sort of catch the people that are doing this. They had to come up with new ways. And so they started sort of, for example, going through Europe. And we might think that this is something that doesn't concern us, Africa and Asia, but we are in Europe, we are not doing anything bad, right? That's not the case. Europe is one of the biggest transport locations for ivory. And that's why it's also our need to actually solve this. And the way that we know where the ivory comes from is this genetic method. So we can generate genetic data for elephants which we know where they come from. And these are these samples in orange. These we know where they were found, the elephants, and what is their genetic information. Then we can put information about these diamonds, signify where the ivory was found. So these blue samples come from a seizure of illegally traded ivory. Somebody was trying to sell the ivory to Asia. And they caught them here and here. And then they did a genetic analysis of the samples that they caught, and they compared it to the samples that we already knew about. And they could then place them here, that they belong from this area. And maybe one point of information doesn't help us a lot. But we have many. I told you there are many seizures of ivory. There's a lot of this going on. And then we can find out what are the main source areas and what are the target areas. And we can try to do something about it. And this is still being done with traditional markers, which for scientific purposes have not really been much used for the last 10, 20 years. We have moved from microsatellites to single nucleotide polymorphisms. And I think that it's time that the conservation also moved and that we transitioned. It's happening in other species. It's happening in lions, chimpanzees, cheetahs, whatever. But elephants are somehow late to the game. So I want to finally catch up. And one last thing. So this is the other thing that we can do for conservation. We can try to know better about our elephants. There are some populations in Africa which have been under study for a long time. For example, this picture comes from Samburu. It's in Kenya. It's a national park. And people have been collecting data about their elephants for 18 years. So they know a lot about them. For example, they have a lot of animals which have radio collars. And they emit the position. And then you can basically, in real time, follow where the animals are moving. And you can try to understand better what are their main routes, which areas are important for them, which animals are spending time together. And again, the next piece of information that we can get is their genetic information. How are they related? Which one is a parent of which? How are these related? And actually, is this really the elephant that we think it is? We can use genetic information to find all that. And again, as with the forensics, in this case also, we need to switch from the traditional markers to the modern techniques, which are not really modern anymore, but in terms of elephant research, they are. And I think it's time that we made a change, and I'm glad that I got the opportunity to do it. And for that, I would like to thank my collaborators, my funding, the University of Copenhagen, who's my host, and L'Oréal and UNESCO for actually giving me a chance to do it. And you for your attention. Thank you.